Welcome to the Family Pictures Podcast. I'm Jim Groom, joined by
Michael Branson Smith.
That's right. And today we're here to talk about Not Without My Daughter, the 1991 film based on the Pulitzer Prize nominated book from 1987 of the same name that relates the daring escape of Betty Mahmoudi and her daughter Mahtab from Iran in 1984. The two were held captive for 18 months by the ostensibly violent and zealous husband, Moody. I love the name. Well, anyway, the book, I'm not done. The book was co-authored by William Hoffer, who also co-authored Midnight Express, the famous movie from '79, which basically has Billy Hayes, who's a Long Islander, selling hashish or trying to get hashish out of Turkey. And so this was a movie that was quite famous. And this movie, or that book, which the movie was based on, was also co-authored by William Hoffer and was adapted into a screenplay for the movie by none other than Oliver Stone, who would later apologize to the Turkish people for his representation of them in that film. In fact, I think one of the consistent things between Not Without My Daughter and Midnight Express is William Hoffer, the author of, or co-author of both memoirs that deal with these Middle Eastern folks and often coming off like devils. So I thought of this film and talking about this film with you today, Michael, because when we were doing that weird TV movie about cheerleading, murdering moms, do you remember that one?
Yeah, it was with Holly Hunter.
Yeah, you seem that like that somehow erases that it was a TV movie. Anyway,
well,
I was.
It's not like this is high cinema we watched for this podcast.
Are you kidding me? I disagree. So basically, this is taking place in 1991, in January of 1991, and for anyone who was around.
Well, the film's release is taking place in 1991, not to be confused with the events actually are taking place in 1984. Just to put that out there.
Thank you. Great clarification. The film is released in 1991 at the same time when Operation Desert Storm, the first Gulf War, happened. So this is coincides with a kind of, moment, a media moment in America that's going to take place for the entire decade of the 90s, all the way and kind of punctuated by 2001 of basically an increasingly anti-Arab, anti-Muslim sentiment in the U.S. and the representation of that in the U.S. gets more and more kind of, how would you say, dire in terms of the division between the two. And I think it's interesting because this movie, in many ways, is not necessarily saying, hearkening back to the '79 Midnight Express. It's just more of the same. But it happens to happen at the same moment you have the moment you have this war and this anti-Middle Eastern sentiment growing in America. And I think it kind of propels it into a more, how would you say, credible piece of propaganda that we can look at more, I think, as a kind of in line with a lot of what I think you see in the U.S. over time, and I'll talk about that more broadly. But anyway, I have more to say, Michael, but I'm going to stop here and let you say something.
Well, I mean, I think it's also good to give the context of, number one, the history of this film, which is it basically coincides with the Iranian Revolution, right? The Islamic Revolution in Iran, where the Shah is deposed in 1979 and taken over by the people. He was an oppressive, American-supported autocrat, and basically the people choose not only to take over in a pretty much a bloodless coup for the most part, by marching on the streets, and there's no major repression. It just happens, and they turn into a very conservative Islamic state at the same time, and that coincides with the Iran hostage crisis, the end of the Carter administration, where it was 444 days a number of Americans are held captive and aren't released basically until Reagan wins the election and makes a deal.
Which some people said was intentional.
Yeah, right. And so there is a lot going on in this context. So as soon as the Islamic State begins, you have its neighboring kind of perennial foe, Iraq, who tries to take advantage of this and invades Iran. And this is the beginning of the 8-year Iran and Iraq War from 1980 to 1988. And that's the context of this film. Is not only do we have the America souring on its relationship with Iran because their autocratic leader, the Shah, was kind of deposed, and it's a very unfriendly Islamic State led by Ayatollah Khomeini, who is like vilified in the cover of Time with like really heavily not photoshopped, dodged and burned as it is in classic photography, where his face is made to look very dark. And he's made to look like an ominous figure with his big beard and turban and darkened sunken eyes, and that's the cover of Time, and that's kind of the picture that repeats itself throughout the setting of this film. How Iran is basically, even though it's shot in Israel, which is, I really would love to have read about the production of like Israelis like seeing all of these Ayatollah symbols all over a film set, and they'd be like, "What is going on?" I mean, I didn't find anything about that, and would have really loved to have read about that. So there is, and so the war between Iraq and Iran is the context of the quote unquote the kind of political violence that's going on. There's 2 bombing scenes in the film, and it's named Iraqis, and there's a response from Moody, the father, who's the doctor and who takes Betty and Matub to Iran for a vacation visit, which turns into an imprisonment for 18 months. There's 2 scenes where there's bombings, and they're obviously part of the Iran and Iraq war. And so there is that political context that's going on at the same time, and in those 2 countries are punishing each other so miserably that they are actually in a pretty bad economic crisis because of it at the same time, and the government is adjusting.
And Moody is very specific to Betty when she said, "I thought we would be safe here," he says, after one of the bombings, which is at the school. It's like, this is all America's fault.
Right.
They're providing the guns, they're providing the bombs, right? And so there are, ideas that this was actually a way of kind of putting pressure back on Iran after the hostage scandal, or not hostage scandal, the hostage crisis. So that is great. That is a great context you're setting up. And I think one of the things that you think about when you think about this depiction of the Iranians, it's not necessarily new. For anyone who's out there who's seen the film by Ben Affleck, Argo, Argo, in some ways, if you think about Argo, it takes various scenes and a whole sense of the film from, I think, Not Without My Daughter. The moments when she's around in the bazaar walking, these whole kind of large billboards of the Ayatollah, like that whole element of this 91 film is, reproduced in Argo. Maybe that's just based on images and all these other things, not pulling from the film, but there is a lot of this whole kind of anti-Iranian sentiment that's reproduced in the Argo film, even, 20 years later, or however many years later, 20 some odd years later. So the anti-Iranian kind of sentiment in the U.S., especially post 2001, has not changed that much, right? Has not really lightened up, given the fact that, America has essentially been at war with the idea of the Middle East for decades now. And I think one of the things that's interesting to me is this is a film that I keep on coming back to again and again. I might have watched this film more over the last 10 years than any other film, which is weird to think about, right?
Yeah, I don't get that. You got to explain that.
Yeah, and so I returned it over to Let's Give because in many ways, this is a perfect piece of modern day propaganda, right? I think it's just beautifully constructed. It really, as a thriller, works really well. It's acted beautifully, But it's a really relevant piece of modern day propaganda for U.S. imperialism in the late 20th and early 21st century. It like works perfectly. And the character of the husband, Moody, shifts from the beginning, and we'll get into this, as a really relatable Iranian doctor in the U.S. suffering from discrimination from other doctors, and then he shifts after the first 13 or 20 minutes of the film into a full-blown monster. And this whole concept of the primitive world of Iran comes up again and again. And so having gone to grad school and having actually done work when I was in grad school, and I know we promised we wouldn't bring any of this academia into it, so I apologize, Michael, but you can't escape Edward Said's idea of Orientalism when you talk about this film. I mean, this is basically the general patronizing Western attitude towards Middle Eastern, Asian, and North American societies. And Said's analysis, the West essentializes, and I'm quoting from Wikipedia here, these societies as
like
static,
a good academic,
and exactly, and undeveloped, thereby fabricating a view of Oriental culture that could be studied, depicted, and reproduced in the service of imperial power. And so, I think that the key for me here, and why I keep coming back to this, is the way in which the film is such a powerful medium for promoting the sense of Western superiority through a one-sided narrative that manipulates by existing on the primitive nature of the other, in this case, the Iranians. But let's go back to something that I kind of saw this film, and I was teaching a class on captivity narratives at Queens College. So we both came to the City University of New York. That's kind of our beginnings. I was an adjunct, and I taught captivity narratives. And I had seen this film not that long before I started teaching this class. And I was like, this is a perfect model for the captivity narrative, but in the context of our current political crisis, right? So we're talking about, it's just post 9/11, and we're seeing Sally Fields in this context of a kind of more recent history. And so this is awesome to me because it was a way to bring the narratives that we were talking about that were from the 17th century, like Mary Rollinson's captivity narrative, where her and her daughter get removed by the Native Americans when they're in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The daughter is killed pretty violently, and she actually has to not only move away from her white culture, but has to adapt in some ways to the Native American culture. And I think for me, the idea about a narrative like this and a movie like this, and this is why I love it so much, is this movie is all about the idea of what is a national identity? What is an imperial identity? How do you understand that? And I think this movie, as a kind of narrative form, is part of a long tradition of American narrative forms about understanding the other, whether it's the slave narrative, whether it's a Native American captivity narrative, and you have captivity narratives that go into the 19th, 20th century. And here's a perfect one about the Middle Eastern. You'll get another captivity narrative in the 21st century with Jessica Lynch, right, who was the one soldier in the Second Gulf War who was captive and was shot up, and they had this whole narrative about her as a Rambo, but in fact she wasn't a Rambo, and the Navy SEALs kind of ripped her off of a hospital bed while she was being operated, and they said, this is this great, a rescue. And it was all kind of trumped up in the media as this kind of great event, the first time the Americans had rescued a prisoner of war since World War II. And a lot of it was just BS. So I'm really interested in this movie as a long tradition of the captivity narrative in America as a way of representing the other to kind of reinforce the kind of white Christian identity that, still very much happening right now. So back to you, Michael.
Back to me. Back to me. Okay, so not prepared for the captivity narrative, but I'll tell you things that come to mind.
Of course, because it's so fucking insightful.
Yeah, so to this thing. So let's start with the early one, which I know Jim is happy to discuss, which is Dances with Wolves, which speaks directly to captivity narrative. And we have Kevin Costner trying to, he does the white savior thing, admittedly, but he does at least try to represent the perspective of the Native American culture. We do hear their language and have it translated, unlike this film where Arabic has no subtitles whatsoever. So it is not unlike the early depictions of in Shogun, the two versions of Shogun. If you look at the first Shogun film, where Japanese is never translated whatsoever with subtitles, whereas this most recent depiction of Shogun through the TV series that was produced, I think, by AMC, I believe. Anyway, that was very much more about Japanese culture and written and produced in collaboration with Japanese producers and creative folks in their television and film industry. And so there are examples, but the one that actually stands out the most is actually Homeland. Did you ever watch Homeland?
I have seen a couple of episodes, but I'm not a big TV series guy.
Okay, so
I mean, I'm
except for The
on
Wire, come on.
Well, yeah, sure. There are certain things like The Sopranos and The Wire and stuff, but there's so many now that you got to be careful. You know?
So the story of Homeland is its first season is very much about this character Brody, who I'm blanking on the first character, who was a captive from the Gulf War. And he's rescued, similarly as you described, in this dramatic way. But the CIA operative, Carrie Matheson, played by Claire Danes, who's been embedded in Iran and Iraq or throughout the Middle East as part of a counterterrorism agent, believes that Brody has been turned, and he is a is an asset of the Iraq at this time, or the terrorist group. So these stories are something that go on to this day. They're very compelling to Americans, and it's part of American exceptionalism. I hear that, and I think that this book, and then subsequently there was also her daughter also wrote a book as well from her perspective. What's interesting about I haven't read the book, but but read some interviews and watched her speak about it a little bit, is she's very much speaks. Number one of the interesting facts is that when Matub's book she was writing her book, she described in an interview how she hadn't read her mother's book yet. All right, intentionally so. I don't know if it's so that she's not, her perspective wouldn't be colored by her mother's perspective, even though I'm sure there's many conversations the two of them had. Both of them became intentionally religious folk up in Michigan, where they returned. And she talks very much about, very quickly through her faith, that she forgave her dad, and she also recognized his desire, even though he subsequently died of a heart attack in the early 2000s. But he
made his own documentary called Without My Daughter.
Yeah. No, and so that I wish I didn't get to see, because
I saw some of it. It's terrible.
And so her kind of setting up, she forgives him, but at the same time she still was afraid of him, so she describes, of how, because he was still trying to, when she went to college, she inadvertently made her number public in their address book at the time, in the early 90s, and he calls her unexpectedly, but it's her mother who happens to pick up and recognizes his voice. And he threateningly says, "I'm going to get you." So, like, their narrative, from their perspective, still goes on, and he had tried to get his point of view out there of what happened, which we're not even represented because we couldn't handle watching it. So, I mean, what good are we in that regard?
But I did see it. It's just terribly produced. You should watch it. It's on YouTube in 6 parts. You can watch it. It's out there for anyone who wants to see it. But in fact, their story, interesting enough, I guess. But what's really the power here is the movie, is the way in which I think the movie works. Like, I think this is some of, like, probably you always talk about where's the exposition. You're always whining about there's not enough exposition. Well, in fact, this is the best 13 minutes of exposition.
No, I've only complained about one movie ever, and that is Female Trouble, which has zero
Amarcord. You're like, Amarcord has no exposition.
It had none, but I fell in love with it.
I wish Fellini would tell me what's going on. Come on. I'm giving you now the best 13 minutes of exposition you're ever going to get in the movie. You get setup. What's the setup, Michael?
Okay,
bring us to the film.
Okay,
bring us in.
I can. All right. So we are introduced to this bucolic McMansion at the top of the hill, which faces a lake, and Moody and his daughter Matub are hanging out, and they're fishing. And Betty is coming down the hillside with her mother with fresh lemonade while her father is gardening nearby. And it couldn't be a more picturesque American family that has access to all of the best in life.
This is America. And we find out that Matub is such a daddy's girl. And, Matub says, when she says, I want to be a nurse, Daddy, Moody says, well, you could be a doctor as well, I mean, this is not a guy that we're going to see just a half an hour later, completely 180, right? And so we note almost immediately a couple of things, right? Moody's a doctor.
Yep.
These people are comfortable, right? They have, like you said, this beautiful lifestyle. The family is connected and fairly happy. But a crack in the system starts to happen when Moody, in the next scene, is shown as at the hospital doing his rounds. And he goes into basically the doctor's lounge room. And you have these two fellow colleagues who start really abusing Moody right in front of him. And Antonella, when we were watching that, said, there are really people like that, and they can be so mean.
Yeah, it was like at a third grade where you basically. This reminds me of, my wife and my daughter back when. In her Brooklyn school, you would go in when it's her first beginning of school, right? And you get to sit them down and socialize your kids so they could settle in to start classes. So it's back when we were, dumped off. That didn't happen. So this had this socialization nature to it. And so there were these three girls sitting at this table, and there's an open seat. And my wife says, oh, can B come sit down with you all? And this one girl says, no, there's no room. And my wife's just like, motherfucker, you are going to make room? And it's like she was about to claw this 7-year-old for being such a so-so bitch so early. And so, yes, this is basically that. And meanwhile, they're playing ping pong in the lounge to emphasize their douche. No. Was it pool?
Pool, that's right. Oh. And they start saying stuff like, Iranians have prayed themselves, referring back to the revolution you're talking about, prayed themselves back into the Stone Age. Why would anyone come to the States to study medicine when you can get a degree in 2 weeks? Yeah. And then the other one says, 7 days. I understand the Ayatollah's got some great ideas about medicine, making martyrs. I mean, they're just right in front of him. They're making fun of the paper that's written in Arabic. I mean, it's just brutal to watch.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
And then Moody, next shot, Moody comes home. This is, again, the best 13 minutes of film you'll ever watch. Moody comes back. He's at the lake. He's listening to classical music, and he's looking out, obviously very emo. And that's when we get this kind of interaction between him, who's played by Alfred Molina, and the great Sally Field, who plays Betty Moody. And she comes in and asks him, what's wrong? What's wrong? And he finally says, look, the doctors are making cracks again. So we learn that this has been going on. It's because he's Iranian. And she says, that's not right. We can get this kind of, we should be able to fight this in court or something else. And
this is America. We have laws.
Exactly. And she basically, and you also find out that they've moved previously because of this. Uh-huh. So this isn't the first time they've dealt with this, right? And so do you remember what happens next?
Well, isn't this where we catch him on the phone with his family back in Iran? and he basically explains to her that he needs to go see his family. They're in constant contact, and
Yes.
he's
homesick.
He's incredibly homesick. And actually, meanwhile, I mean, Betty and Matob's description of Moody harkens his interest in the fundamentalism, which is interesting in contrast to the film's portrait. So basically, Matob is born the same year of the Islamic revolution in Iran, right? Basically 1979. And Betty in the book, or Matob in her interview, describes how he became obsessed, right?
Yeah.
So that's not portrayed at all in the film. It's
No.
more of being sick for not like his sister. He describes how their parents are dead, and it's his sister who's really, really missing him. It's Ahmed, who's really portrayed as like the evil manipulator. Ahmed Borzog, played by Moni Ray. She is really, really guilt tripping him.
Yeah, and she needs him to come back, and so he's starting to work on Betty. And the next scene is Moody is up, putting Matob to bed and reading her a story in bed. He's reading her Aladdin, and he's telling her about how beautiful Persia is and that he's Persian, and now they call Persians Iranians, and there are mosques made of jewels that glitter in the light and caves filled with this. And then at the end of that, Matob says, "Daddy, do we really hate Americans because you're from Iran?"
Oh, yeah.
And you can see his face just drop, and just, I just think this is brilliant. He's getting all excited. He's giving his daughter a cultural lesson, and then bam, punch in the face. "Daddy,
Right.
do we really hate Americans?" And then he says, like your wife said to that 7-year-old, "Actually, no, blah, 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 blah." But, that pain hasn't stopped.
Well, yeah. Well, the context is that Matob in school has been teased for her Iranian name yet again, because Matob is not a very Saxon styled Christian name. And yeah, what's funny is like these kind of depictions. There's an interesting TV movie that does the exact same thing called V, which is one of my favorite pieces of science fiction from the 80s, actually. And it's all about, basically the aliens are Nazis and the way that they initially ingratiate themselves with the community. We're going to give you great technology. We're going to build your world up to something better. And then they try to literally eat them, which is freaking awesome.
It's like Twilight Zone.
Yeah. And so, but there's as part of the early beginnings of oppression, they're like they're going after scientists and intellectuals. And there's a girl coming home from school with her bike, and I put this clip on my YouTube channel because I loved it so much. And their parents go to her, and it's like, "What happened? What happened to your bike? Why are you all scratched up?" "They called me a dirty scientist kid."
That's awesome, actually.
Yeah. And so this kind of simplistic, portrait of children being abusive is a counter to the world that is more complex.
We get the first kind of, really deceitful moment on Moody's part, because he says to her in response, "I've been here 20 years. You were born American." And he said, "Look, I'm as American as apple pie."
Right.
I mean, he actually says that.
Yeah.
And then there's the part where Moody is now doing a hard sell on Betty about, "Look, I got to go back to Iran. My family needs to see me. I haven't seen Iran in 10 years. I'm homesick. I really need to do it." And, Betty's like, "I'm scared. It's dangerous over there. Why would we all the kind of, all the, cliches come out about, going to a dangerous country." And so what does Moody do to convince her to go back?
Yeah, he basically swears in the Quran that they'll come back, which apparently truly happened in real life. But the thing that I think is the failure, in part of this just like simplistic portrait of the situation, I kept thinking about, well, wow, Moody, if he came here 20 years ago, so that's 64, so he benefited from the positive relationships between the United States and Iran, led by the Shah at that time. He was educated in the United States, probably both undergraduate, if not definitely medical school. And there's just no portrait of that whatsoever. It's all simplified as I'm an American as apple pie. And this idea of this turn really happened for a reason in his mind. And so that is described briefly as like when the Islamic Revolution happened. And it would make sense that he's like wants to go back to his culture if he's so abused in his workplace and in his community, seeing his daughter abused for her Iranian name. And so that is all washed over. None of that is really presented particularly in any sort of nuanced way what his thinking is whatsoever.
Yeah, not until later, when he's actually in Tehran, there's a moment when he says, the idea of coming after the Shah and how beautiful it is. You have no idea what this means for our people. And she kind of doesn't because she's freaked out at this point. But so that's the first 13 minutes of the film. Boom. And then cut to plane landing in Tehran, Moody, Betty, and Mahtab coming out of the airport, and all hell breaking loose. Yeah. Complete chaos, right? Like the kind of that call that happens, the cars with the flowers taped to them, the images of the Ayatollah angrily looking at everybody, and like basically they're taking her daughter away from her right away, and the family swarming them, and then they go to the house and they open the car door and there's a dead goat with really kind of the blood coming off, and his neck has been cut or sliced. I mean, it is a really radical shift from that America, that bucolic America you could describe, to this kind of decaying, like war-torn, horrific vision of a city that is Tehran. And I think that shift and that kind of like whiplash is really powerful as a manipulative moment to take you as a viewer into this foreign land, and then you begin the suspense of the film and all of this kind of, building up to the captivity and then escape that will happen for the rest of the hour and a half.
Yeah, there's a lot of conversation right away. Betty receives her first gift from the family, which is actually not really a gift. It's a chador, which is somewhat similar to a hijab, which is like it's a full body cloak. She's not veiled. But you have to cover your hair. So Iranians at the time wore a version of a hijab that women weren't necessarily veiled, but they did cover their whole bodies and their hair, and that comes up as something that's important later on.
Yeah, and actually not too later on. I mean, we go to the apartment. And we go up on the roof, and there's a couple of scenes up on the roof of this apartment. And one of the first things we see is the university students doing their Friday prayer. And as part of that Friday prayer, to your point, if this is filmed in Israel, there's a big, gigantic banner with these blood-covered knives. Yeah. And they have the names of like U.S., Israel, USSR, and Saudi Arabia. And it's really like, Ayatollah all over, but it's really kind of, off-putting to see like, not only are these people different, these people hate us. And that's kind of what Betty is coming to terms with throughout the next 30 or 40 minutes of the film.
I mean, but if you really think about it too, it's kind of nuts to think like those four countries were all operating in concert against Iran at the time, right? You had Iraq being supported by both the Soviet Union and the United States, and Israel and Saudi Arabia, it's just really wild to think about.
And which makes sense why Moody, as part of his national identity, would want to return and kind of, they would want to protect their sense of self and their sense of nation against all of these assaults from the outside. Like, in that regard, it makes a lot of sense. But in this regard, as an American movie and Betty going there for the first time, it's really like scary, right?
Yeah.
Like, you understand why she's scared and why she wants to escape. And immediately in this film. So, like you said, there's no subtitles, right? We never know what they're saying, which makes it even more kind of we're being made alien and we're put in the kind of space of an outsider. And there's the whole Shador. But this is the first time when the concept of they're talking on the roof, and it's kind of light. Remember they had that whole scene where they talk about the showers?
Oh,
And the idea of every time you shower, it means you've just made love because you have to clean yourself if you're gonna be pray after that. So she's showering 3 times a day, and they're like, "Wow, they must really have sex."
They're
a lot."
rabbits.
But it's at the same time that Sally Field, we hear for the first time this idea of primitive, right? And she just says, "It just seems so primitive sometimes. Why are they so afraid of women's sexuality?" And then he says, no, that's not the case. In the 70s, they fought for that idea of the Shador and all of that. And so it's the first time where we hear this concept of primitive, which comes up again and again, even by Moody himself. But that's that whole Orientalism. I mean, essentially like textbook definition by Edward Said, who wrote that book, I think in 76 or 79. Like, this is a textbook definition of it, this movie. It's like, it's a scholar's, like, delight to see this and be like, this is exactly what I'm talking about. It's beautiful. So there's also the whole idea of Moody's too Americanized. He's got an American wife, his family. I don't know about you, but every time they're talking, it's as if they're fighting viciously with each other, right? Moody and his family.
Yeah, I think it goes into the counter to kind of the conservative, Puritan styled white American perspective of how families relate. And that cuts across all sorts of cultural differences, right? It's like
Italians,
and African American families, and aggression is seen as like it's seen as aggression is probably a better way of saying it. Like loudness is automatically aggression and therefore unacceptable, and so yes, because we see the separation of the sexes at dinner. They're sitting on the floor because all the furniture was removed. Because as soon as they adopted the dictates of the Quran, furniture becomes this thing that's westernized. So it was all ditched. So they're all eating on rugs, and so yeah, I mean that loudness is something that automatically becomes quote unquote normalized as is unacceptable. And I think that happens across all sorts of portraits of American portraits of culture.
Yeah, and this is the beginning. Like, so Betty at this point is still under the impression they're going home, and the fact is Moody will get up and pray. And then we start every morning, and this is when Betty says, "No, stay in." And he's like, "What's wrong with you? They're direct descendants of Muhammad. Why would you say that?" And that's the first time you see.
That's the first
Moody.
One. Yeah,
Moody.
that is like literally the first. Everything prior to that, he's been trying to placate Betty and reassure her that their family is going to be returning to Michigan. Like, it's just different. They want to love you is some kind of the things
you'll get used to it.
Right.
Says.
Yeah. You'll get used to it. But it's soon after, that he finally confesses. And even the confession includes this initially, it's not my fault situation where they failed to register their passports before returning to be allowed to return to the airport and fly out. And Betty's just kind of like looking at him and his brother, because his brother's speaking in Arabic and he's being aggressive and saying like, basically you're inferring like you haven't told her yet, have you? And he's like, because he's shaking his head. And then finally he says it. He says,
the brother tells him, you can't go because the passports, right?
Right.
But then Moody comes out and says, we're not leaving. We're not going back.
Right.
And I think the best moment in the film for Sally Field is at that moment that he says that. And she's like, I want Mahtab to grow up here. I want her to become a Muslim. And Betty just desperately is like, no, no. She says it like over and over. And it's not the kind of just screaming no. It's just this kind of quietly desperate no. And that defines, Sally Field's character kind of until she, gets onto Turkish soil at the end of the movie. Like, she just basically does everything she can to get out of Iran.
Right. I mean, she's doing something for her daughter, just like, Holly Hunter did.
Without my daughter. This is far greater than what Holly Hunter did. Holly Hunter is just an idiot who didn't know what she was doing. This is a woman who has
a real mission.
National pride.
So, it is also, I think it's that this is also the first time where, we saw the heel turn of Moody beginning, and then it is now emphatic. He literally pulls a fist out to his wife. I don't know if he hits her yet. If he has, no. I think he may have, but he says, "You're in my country now. You do as I say. You understand me. We are staying here." So it's emphatic with a fist, that statement.
And this is the beginning of the imprisonment. And there's basically, she escapes to talk to the Swiss embassy. She finds out that she has no rights. She's a Iranian citizen. If she leaves or divorces him, she loses the daughter. So you start to feel that imprisonment get even tighter. Even when you think maybe she escaped to the Swiss embassy, things just get more and more kind of dire for Betty. And then Betty changes strategy.
Right. Well, she does. I think it's important to also say, like, she initially, even before, she tries to plead with the family, right?
Yes, that's right.
She tries to, Betty, asks, not Nazarene, but Mamal, I think Mamal, to translate for her to, the patriarch of the family, not even to direct, because there's a patriarch who's never named even.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. And she's saying, like, my husband swore to me on the Quran that he would take us home. Isn't that wrong? Isn't that wrong? And they basically say, like, and they're all kind of they're getting more heated as they all discuss what she's describing, because it's being translated. We don't know if it's being translated accurately at all.
Exactly.
There's nothing, the audience is just left to interpret it. But the one translation that's given back to Betty is that, he'll be forgiven, right? Is that, so that's like, this is justified because he'll be forgiven. So yes. And then she goes on, she realizes, I have to try to get out of here, and she goes to the Swiss embassy, because of course there is no U.S. embassy in Iran at this time, and the Swiss diplomat is not particularly sympathetic at first.
No, not at all.
And she reappears later, much more sympathetic, but it's kind of a sidecar story at that point. And she's trying to imagine that, I'll just be able to escape, and but this is when the beginnings, like, this is where Moody begins to literally beat Betty and threatens to kill her.
Yeah, exactly, several times, even beat the daughter. Yeah. And so, like, there are moments in the school, but the interesting piece here is this is the time when she's trying to assimilate. Yeah. And so she comes when it's Mahtab's birthday. Yeah. And she grabs Moody's hand, and so she almost seduces him into believing, like, look.
Oh, she literally seduces him.
Yeah, she does, right? She's to get out of the apartment, get into Nasreen's apartment, and basically start fresh. So she has a new position where she's somewhat outside of the family's gaze.
Yeah, and it's also interesting because we also learn for the first time around this time that Moody's actually struggling to get a job as a doctor.
Because, do you remember why?
Because he was educated in the United States.
Exactly. So it just went. I love that piece, and that's like when the movie has almost glimmers of hope, where it's trying to understand both sides. Yeah. It doesn't. But there are moments when you think, oh wow, like obviously now the shoe is on the other foot. Moody, how does it feel, right? and you're getting what you got in America. And so there you kind of feel or want to feel for Moody. But he's at this point, he's too far gone. He's constantly reminding her she's under surveillance. Same rules apply. Whatever, we're always watching you. You have no way to escape. And over time, it gets a little bit easier so that Betty can get out. But the thing that's interesting to me is in the classical captivity narrative, one of the things that happens and is always questioned about the people is, did you assimilate? If you assimilated too much, say, with the Native Americans, right? People brought you into question. Like Mary Rowlandson, at first she said their food, it was terrible. You couldn't even eat it. Later in the narrative, she starts talking about how savory the food is. And one of the things that happened is people started questioning, so did you start to enjoy being there? Was that something, did you start to turn, right, into that, or kind of be pulled into that cultural idea and like it? And there is insistence throughout this movie when they're kind of together, just Mahtab and Betty. They're praying to the Lord. She's telling her, you have to look for any sign so that we can get out here. It's always about that. There's never a question that Betty had any love for that culture or that religion or that place. It was clear. And it's interesting because that insistence is part of that propaganda and that idea of questioning whether she ever kind of fell in love with the Quran or with that culture, like the other American woman she meets, who's like, you'll get used to it. You'll fall in love. The Quran is beautiful, right? And so there's no sense of that. This movie is just doubling down on the otherness.
And it's in contrast to real life where Mahtab talks about, when she's much older, how to this day she and her mother still serve a traditional Persian breakfast, right? Which is basically flatbread and I can't remember the elements of it actually, and yogurt or something. I can't remember what it is. And because she even talks about how she initially rejected her Persian name and became Amanda or Mandy, but then reclaimed it as she identified still with Persian culture. Because it is sad because she was a daddy's girl. She did have this really connected relationship with her father. They kind of typify it in the film as through his science. She's going to be a good little. She's so smart, because she can. I don't know what is the thing that they have her do. Parents have their kids do little tricks by spouting facts. I can't remember what the facts were that were scientific related. Anyway, so there is that connection that we understand does actually exist between Mahtab and Persian vitamins.
With citrus, vitamin D, and fiber. What vitamins are in this?
And bananas versus lemons, right? Thank you.
Exactly.
That's it. And so you're right. I mean, that's the film does like to literally whitewash that stuff in this context.
Yeah, and it poses it. And it's interesting to me. The most interesting thing about this film for me is the first 13 minutes and then the subsequent hour and 45 minutes. And the fact is it's a very tight narrative, right? It has very clear spaces, right? There's the point where they're kind of in this bucolic, idyllic thing. This is the point where they go there, things start to change. There's the imprisonment, there's the appeasement, and then there's the escape, right? So it's very tightly structured.
You might say real life has the makings of a Hollywood story, Jim.
I would say, obviously you bring in the same author who hit bank with Midnight Express, right? That's not a coincidence, I imagine, right? And then she goes on as an author to talk about, saving people from foreign cultures that are strange. But I appreciate it. So I read the Ebert review because I kind of like his reviews. And he talks about how it's a good, well-acted, strong structured movie, kind of like I Believe. But the other thing he says, and this is kind of, for me, I like to read movies as a cultural moment, right? I love to see movies as a reflection of the moment we're in. 1991, Gulf War, this movie comes out. In terms of Iran, that's still fresh on any mind of a kid from the 70s. I remember being in elementary school, looking at one of those globes that had the kind of like topography mountains that came off the globe and you would spin it.
Yeah.
And, you know, the whole hostage crisis, me and the rest of the class would look at Iran, like, where's Iran?
Yeah.
And be like, that's the enemy. Like, it was so clear. And that there was a certain amount of fervency in America that was anti-Iranian. Like, a serious, like, that was not kind of something you say, oh, yeah, you know, that was a moment. Like, no, it was fervent. People hated Iran. That whole idea of the hostage crisis was serious business in terms of getting the Americans worked up. And I think that to me is what I like about this film is, and he says it well, Ebert, he's like, it's an invitation to thought. Like, what is this movie really saying? Like, what is it telling you about your own culture, about other cultures, and about our relationship to our own identity and who we are? And I dig that. Like, I dig that this movie is so over the top, right? Is so in your face that unless you're just a rabid racist and a rabid, like, you can't help but say, like, am I being manipulated here? Potentially, like, are they really just kind of pulling all of my different chords to make me hate these people? Right? It's almost like the machine that is Hollywood for a moment in this film is just laid bare, and you kind of understand like how this propaganda works, and it's a very easy film to demonstrate it with.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mean, it's funny. I was just looking up the Iran hostage crisis again to remember some of the context of that event. You know, I was only 8 years old when it happened, and I think I was probably more obsessed with fear of nuclear war at that time, to be honest. But you didn't finish Ebert. What was the contrasting thing? Because I think that, I mean, he was someone who's older, so his perspective obviously is more adult from that time, and I imagine it is influenced by the Iran hostage crisis.
And he basically says, look, there's two reasons to watch it. One is undeniable dramatic strength, good structure, good performance. And then two, and I'll quote him a little bit here, he says, it's harder to explain. I think the movie should be seen because it's an invitation to thought. It can be viewed as simply a one-sided and bitter attack, but it also provides an opportunity for testing our own prejudices, our own senses of fairness. Must all movies be taken on their own terms, or do we retain the strength of mind to view them critically, right? To remain alert to prejudice and single-minded vitriol. So he does, I think, like I like to read films, like this is a perfect movie to kind of exemplify, like, can you read this critically and understand how much you're being manipulated?
It's funny because he's being very careful in that explanation.
He is, absolutely.
He's not outright calling this like a piece of racist propaganda, but he's kind of alluding towards that exists in this film, and that's kind of interesting.
Well, it says here, he goes on, he goes, look, it is curious in a way that this movie is set in Iran. At the time its events take place, and at the time the film was made, Iran was our enemy and Iraq was our ally. Now times have changed, and Saddam Hussein, president of Iraq, is our enemy. Think of the box office possibilities if the movie had been set in Iraq, right? So almost thinking like in terms of like all of these things are kind of part of how the machine works.
Right.
Right? These I mean, just think about Conclave and the Pope, right? Antonella's like, do you really think that they put out Conclave because they knew the Pope was really sick and that it would possibly be popular? I'm thinking to myself, like, absolutely. Like, that's how these things work.
Yeah, it is the engine of Hollywood is constantly trying to read the tea leaves. And as Wayne Gretzky would say, you go to where the puck is, you think the puck is going to be, not where the puck is at the moment.
Exactly, right? Yeah,
So yeah,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. The funny thing is, we are the Family Pictures podcast, and so this is ultimately about a mom trying to save her daughter from this captivity, and it does turn into this classic like escape, narrative, which is actually kind of fun. I mean, that's the kind of fun part of the
great.
film.
Yeah, absolutely.
is her being forced to be trusting, and then almost being raped for a hot minute, and then but then escaping because there's a benevolent person who who seems to be manipulating her, but then it's revealed through no dialogue, because again, there's no subtitles throughout the film, that he's returning her personal effects, and it's through mountains and through valleys, and they're staying in dire circumstances, and there's checkpoints to be crossed, and with a lot of concern that you're going to suddenly be pulled out and shot and stuff like that.
And then the final scene, obviously, you get past it. I mean, quick note to Hussein, who's kind of the Shah loyalist, and there's a few of them, and they're the ones who just want to get Betty out because they love America. And they love freedom, and they're not worried about money. Like, they're not at all like coyotes or smugglers.
What's the iconography of Western culture in his shop?
The dress shirt.
Exactly. It's
the Oxford dress shirt.
Exactly. So it's like hits you in the face with his with his Western identity. It's like he literally sells Western men's dress shirts.
But even to exactly. And even to the last point when, our Betty gets over the border, gets into Turkey, which ironically, unlike in Midnight Express, is the safe space, and looks at, there's an American flag flying over a wall, and it's gigantic and beautiful. And it says, honey, it's all right, we're home.
Right.
And that's it. Now, another criticism of this movie, and I think it's interesting watching it because I don't always pick up on this, is the soundtrack. People like the background music for the soundtrack, like whenever they're in America or doing American things, it's like you said, bucolic, utopian. Whenever Ayatollah comes on, or there's the Iranians, it's like dun-dun, 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 dun-dun. And so like the way in which even the music manipulates you, and there is a lot of criticism. I think it's Jerry Goldsmith, a lot of criticism of his soundtrack for this, and how manipulative it is, like the whole film. And I don't know why I keep coming back to this film, but I think part of it is, to Ebert's point, like I think it's a real interesting demonstration for me about remaining critical of these things we're fed in the media, which is what we saw in that teenage murdering alleged TV movie that made me think of it.
Well, she was a good mom. She just wanted to help her daughter achieve her place in society.
She wasn't nearly as good as Sally Field in this. Like Sally Field she literally risked execution to save her daughter.
Well, what a woman will do to not become a pariah and reclaim her status in American society.
I am getting the sense, Michael, and I might be wrong here, but I am getting the sense that you didn't love this movie.
No. I mean, I love Sally Field. I mean, God knows I loved her as Gidget. So, I found, I get this reading of it as a piece of propaganda is compelling. But as a movie, because it's just such a piece of propaganda, it's not necessarily compelling. And we've kind of done this. We've kind of like beat ourselves into this picture of a place where we're picking films that we're reading them more than just trying to enjoy them for their portraiture and love. Like starting with, God, it's such a good art movie, Female Trouble, through the TV movie, through this film that is important picture that we have to
So you don't like important pictures. You just want to watch TV movies.
No. Yeah, let's go back to V. Let's do V. V would be awesome. Did you ever watch V? It's so good.
I never have, no.
Oh my God, it's so good. As someone who loves horror, basically, I mean, this is trashy TV movie, science fiction horror. Ultimately,
that's probably why I haven't seen it.
There's a scene where this woman, she unlocks her jaw and eats a guinea pig. It's awesome. Anyway, no, I mean, I'm Alfred Molina's acting is good, but I think he's constrained. Like he doesn't get to connect to a nuanced character. His character is so starkly one thing, right? Where he's the American Pie dad to he's the maniacal, abusive father who's forcing his daughter and mother to conform to, the new norms of what life is. And even so, for me, Alfred Molina is kind of stuck in a space where he doesn't get to what is my motivation of a character, and same thing with Sally Field. Like, even this is by far, it's not like Sally Field. They're both very good actors, and so it's what makes you stay connected. And the more you watch film and you see average performances with you take, like, so for a classic example, this is the easy nerd example. It's like you take Harrison Ford working through George Lucas Star Wars dialogue and making it seem something worth listening to, right? Yeah. That's what this film has. It is very clunky ultimately. Yes, it's a perfect structure because the situation, it's a classic here to there story. It's like, oh, we go from this place to this place and then back to this place. And it's a compelling narrative based on the nature of just the way, I don't know, the murdering mom story is. It's like compelling. It's trashy ultimately what happened here. This happens to be just more high-minded. And so I'm invested in, Sally Field escaping, but even though I know she's going to escape because she's literally been beaten and her daughter's been beaten. And, and those scenes are and I think the worst one happens in the school, mind you, in front of the women who run the school. And it is awkward because they at times they try to be sympathetic. Like the women of the school are sympathetic to Sally Field in a moment.
They are.
And they're presented as very conservative, but they say there are lines, right?
Yeah.
No.
She says,
we can't give you the telephone. We can't let you leave without your husband's permission.
That's right.
And so we're given glimpses of some nuance here, and so that's ultimately it makes me think of what and if you I saw both TV shows of I mentioned is the story of the man who's kept in captivity in Imperial Japan. Why am I blanking on the name of it? Shogun. So, I saw both versions, and it's really interesting to see, like, this film is the Shogun TV series of the 80s, which people loved, mind you, and that is another captivity story. And similarly, he's completely alienated where we don't hear any of the Japanese versus the newer Shogun where the captive is marginalized as a character. He is not the primary character.
So let me ask you this. Let's make that comparison between this and let's just say Argo, right? Argo kind of, puts the captives. It's a captivity narrative.
Yeah, it's
too.
6 of the Americans that escape the 444 days of captivity through this ruse of a movie that's going to be made. Okay,
and it's a compelling movie, in many ways great, but I would say, from 91 to like 2010 or 12, whenever that film is made, there's not too much kind of progress in the portraiture of the Iranians, right? Like, they don't come across that much better in Argo than they did in Not Without My Daughter.
So do you think, that's interesting to think, because if you think about it, like Shogun's portrait of Japan is in the 80s when Japan was the boogeyman economically.
Sure.
And so since they've been defanged and now are subservient economically once again, we can effectively create this new version of Shogun that is more sympathetic to Japanese culture because we have access to it and we connect to it. Because never mind that, because I think Argo is kind of confusing this kind of concern. I think it would be more interesting. It's like, would they literally be able to remake this movie the way that they did Shogun? And would they ever do it to try to reclaim and show Iranian culture's perspective? Because that's what the new show. Because you haven't watched it, I can tell you haven't watched the Shogun series, which I
have. I watched the new one.
Oh, you watched the new one? Did you watch the original with Richard Chamberlain?
No, but I watched the new one.
Okay, and what did you?
I liked the new one.
Yeah,
I liked it.
Okay,
I didn't love it. And I just want to say, these are the kind of breakthroughs we need on the Family Picture Podcast.
Well, thank you, Jim, for leading us through this reading of a film. I promise.
You hate that we're reading a film. What the fuck else are we going to do if we're not going to talk about a film with our intellect?
We are. We talk with our hearts on our
Reading.
sleeves.
You're
Jim.
like now you got me self-conscious. Like, am I reading in too much into this film? It's like, why the hell am I watching it then? Right?
I don't know. Why do you
You're
watch
complicating
movies?
everything. You're complicating everything, Michael.
I think that's our job, Jim. We are two sides of a coin in this podcast. Okay.
Yeah, I was talking about this at the beginning and doing my little reading, and I could see you like, oh my God, here we go. He's going to read it, and he's going to pull out his fucking, his fucking grad school credentials for this motherfucker. And you did not like it.
I was just the artist who wanted to make movies at the same time. So that's the problem. I'm trying to reclaim my lack of success in making movies. You're trying to reclaim your lack of success in academia. So
It's true.
We are both working on the same vein here. I want to talk about the craft. I want to talk about.
I could give two shits about the craft. I just want to sound smart.
Where's my split diopters, Jim?
The non-diegetic nature of this podcast is driving me crazy. That's awesome.
Yeah,
I think we're going to spare you our our female trouble and let you go. But thanks for listening again to the Family Pictures podcast. We'll be back with a lesser reading of a film.
A less complicated film?
It's not complicated. This wasn't a complicated film. With a less problematic discussion between me
I
and
have an
Michael.
idea of how we're going to do that, but I'm not going to say it until after.
Well, you're up next.
all
So
right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.